I want to welcome you all to the Carr Center Human Rights to Water and Sanitation program, and this is our first study group of the year. Last year we ran a pretty successful study group, lots of more familiar faces. Welcome, Sophie. And basically the point of this study group is really to be a place to engage around issues of equitable access to water and sanitation, and be a safe place as well to explore these questions and think about how do we really implement and apply the recent UN General Assembly resolution and the Human Rights Council resolution, recognizing that the human rights to water and sanitation do exist in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And we're really delighted to have with us a very well-known guest with us today, Patricia Jones. Let me start off by embarrassing Patricia, which is Patricia runs the Environmental Justice Program at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, and they were actually the client for an NPP2 last year who won an award from the Carr Center for an excellent PAE, and looked at implementing or developing a human rights impact assessment tool for a beverage company that had adopted a human right to water policy. Now, we had an opportunity to hear the company representative at World Water Week in Stockholm, and publicly and before an audience of, say, a couple of hundred people said, there is one person that we've been working with who is probably the most well-known, well-educated experts on the issue of the human right to water and sanitation, and that's Dr. Patricia Jones. So Mark and I were beaming with pride that we know Patricia. And as you probably can tell by all the initials after her name, she is a lawyer by training. She also has a PhD in international water law and has a long history of working on social justice issues. And really, the UUSC is a small organization, I think, in terms of staff and her program, but has a huge impact and a huge reach around the world. So I'm really delighted that she's going to be sharing her experiences working in Bolivia. And also, we have a special guest, Julién Párez Barriga, who's joining us from La Paz, Bolivia. And so he's actually joining us by Skype, and Patricia is actually going to introduce him. So welcome, and after introductions, maybe we can just briefly have everyone just introduce themselves, and then we'll get the presentation started.
Great. Thank you very much for that. That is embarrassing. The person she was speaking about is one of the top public relations people for PepsiCo, so he has a chance to be a little more expansive in his description than is actually accurate.
It is accurate. It's accurate.
So did you want to go around?
Sure. Well, I didn't want to know if you wanted to introduce Julián first.
I'm going to, Julián, te vamos a presentar that I would like to put his work experience in context when we get to the case study a little bit. Pero Julián, si quieres saludar a las personas aquí en este momento.
Ok. ¿Cuántas personas son, Patricia, más o menos?
Somos como 12, algo así.
Ah, perfecto. Bueno, un saludo a todos y un gusto de estar conversando con ustedes. Espero que sea esta sesión provechosa para ustedes y para mí también. Un gusto y un saludo desde Bolivia.
It's a very great pleasure to meet you. I just give you my greetings from Bolivia, and I'm looking forward that we have a lot to gain from this experience today.
Great. So I am Sharmila Murthy. I am a fellow here at the Carr Center. This is my second year here, and I am helping lead the Human Rights to Water and Sanitation program and doing research. And by training, I'm a lawyer and also have a degree from the Kennedy School.
And I'm Mark Williams, and I'm the other fellow at the Carr Center. And welcome. I think we have an exciting year coming up, and I'm a lawyer also by training and just joined in May.
So welcome everybody, and for those of you who joined late, we're also joined by somebody who's joining us from Bolivia via Skype, and so Patricia is going to introduce Julián soon.
Great. Just to begin, I'd like to express our deep congratulations and gratitude to the Kennedy School, and particularly the Carr Center and Sharmila and Mark for their efforts to include in Harvard study, research, dialogue on the human right to water. For today, so thank you very much and for having us here today. Today, Sharmila and Mark asked us to focus on a civil society perspective. So what we're going to do today, we've done introductions. We're going to talk about a little bit of an international context for the case study. The case study is El Alto in Bolivia. We're going to introduce Julién Párez, who is on Skype. In case we do have a problem with a call getting dropped or the connection getting dropped, we might be going back and forth a little bit with the technology, but we have plan B and C, so I think we'll be okay and make sure that Julién can participate. So I'm going to give a couple of introductory remarks. I'm going to introduce, give you a little bit of biographical sketch of Julién and who he is in terms of civil society in Bolivia. And then he has prepared a presentation in Spanish that we've worked for about a week now to translate into English. He asked if I wouldn't mind presenting in English rather than him struggling through it. So I'm going to present his presentation in English. A few comments about reflections that I can share. And then we'll do, the bulk of the session we hope is question and answer. That will be I will do interpretation. Anybody here speak Spanish? Great. So we'll do a collective interpretation. So if you see me struggling, you know a word, join right in. And of course, Julién understands English, prefers to be able to communicate in his first language. So to start out a little bit, who's UUSC? We're a human rights organization. We were established in the 1940s, trying to assist and evacuate people whose human rights were being violated in the Second World War. Our work is based on the Declaration of Human Rights law, the existing human rights instruments, and Unitarian Universalist principles. If you have not heard of the Unitarian Universalists, this is a liberal religious community, one of the older ones in this country. We work with, in our human right to water practice, we work with 14 NGO partners. Our theory of social change is that civil society, in particularly grassroots organizations, can be levers for change and defending human rights. So our work works with, in collaboration and partnership with NGOs around the world. Our work is an organization UUSC started in 2005. So there's three ways that we work with our partners around the world. One is developing model law, actually including in the United States, addressing violations of the human right to water, and developing models, positive models for implementation. So that's a little bit about who we are. So it seems like everyone here has an understanding of the human right to water, has participated in the past, so I won't spend too much time going into detail, but it's access to safe, sufficient, affordable water for daily human needs for those who may be new. This is a picture from California. We happen to have a human right to water bill package that's active in the California legislature right now. This is Catarina de Albuquerque on the left of the big blue water drum. Excuse me, you're right. She visited the United States on mission in February and March and was in California for the introduction of the legislation. Catarina de Albuquerque is the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to water and sanitation, formerly independent expert. It's a little bit about her mandate. The mandate was established in 2008 as an independent expert. It was expanded and extended in March of 2011. The Special Rapporteur, to be a Special Rapporteur, she reports, in fact, this week to the UN Human Rights Council. So if you're interested in watching how this kind of policy unfolds, you can watch, usually streaming live video, the session. It's the 18th session for the Human Rights Council. She will be presenting her reports on good practices, her mission report on the United States, which I hope those of you who are interested have a chance to read. It's very enlightening if you have an interest in Bolivia, but also want to make a comparison to a developed country context. It's a good insight on the challenges in the water and sanitation sector in the United States. Julién has a neighbor there in La Paz.
We cannot translate that.
She's presenting a compendium on good practices in part of her report. What's coming up for her mandate. She's going to be focusing on national water plans and defining her work plan for the rest of the year. And I don't know if you all are going to make an announcement about that later in the session, but further implementation of the human right to water, focusing on non-discrimination, on really marginalized communities. And she was very impacted in her visit here in February, particularly in February in California during her mission, by the situation of homeless people in the United States. So looking at, in particular, at communities that are very marginalized who don't have access. And also, which we're very happy that she will be able to focus some attention on, is the water shut-off policies.
And one, in the study sheets, which were online and there's hard copies there are hyperlinks to all of her recent reports and the additional resources.
So that's Julién, and actually the Women's Committee of FEJUVE, Federation of Neighborhood Associations of El Alto. So FEJUVE has had a collaboration with UUSC since 2005. Julién, who we have online that Sharmila introduced very briefly, is currently the technical advisor. What we'd like to do right now is to go directly into the case study. I had a couple of slides I wanted to show. This is some of the work that FEJUVE did. This was a popular education piece during their campaign. This is one of the current managers of one of the offices of EPSAS, the utility there, and Julién. So the case study is the water and sanitation utility in El Alto and La Paz. Julián's prepared his presentation, which we'll go into in just a moment. And as I said, I'd like to share just briefly some reflections about the challenges for water and sanitation utilities, and then we'll do an interpreted question and answer period for the bulk of the session, we hope. So let me just switch to the other. Julián's slides. Newer version of PowerPoint than we have. What Julién wanted to show with this slide, as he explained to me, is that we have a very concentrated period of time when we have a seesaw between a public utility, private utility, back to public utility. But there's some highlights here. Small print, I know, but I just want to go over so that you can capture this tremendous change that happened in Bolivia. 1980s and 90s, developing countries had a lot of debt that they were having to deal with. Structural adjustment and privatizations were in the late 80s and 90s the response to failed states and debt. This clearly happened, was the case in Bolivia. In 1997, AISA, is Aguas de Alemani, which is the Suez, created a water and sewerage utility concession in El Alto and La Paz. The first water war happened in 2000 in Cochabamba in Bolivia. You might have heard about that. Was a Bechtel concession. 30 wounded, 1 death in that very concentrated conflictive period in 6 months. There was a gas war in El Alto in 2003. Also, civil society engaged with the government. There were privatizations in the gas sector. In that tragic incident, 400 wounded, 67 deaths. Recently, the officials have been brought to account in the last week or so. Maybe we can get into that in the question and answer period, but it's taken the better part of 10 years to accomplish that. 2003, the current president flees Bolivia because of the conflict. The vice president takes over. The second water war happens in El Alto. Tremendous upheaval in the country. Carlos de Mesa resigns. The president of the Supreme Court takes over power and assumes the responsibility of the transition for elections, 2005. Evo Morales is elected. In the fall, 2006, President Morales takes office. In February, establishes the first and new Ministry of Water, concentrating rather than separating water in the environment, in public services, in agriculture, trying to concentrate all of the management of water into one department. So, one of the few in the world, actually. February established. March begins negotiations with the concessionaire, with Suez, in Mexico City at the World Water Forum. 2006, Evo Morales also presents a project for legal project for a new constitution for the country. Lots of conflict arises as a real result of the discussions of the new constitution. The primary driver is the oil sector, oil and gas sector of those conflicts, but water is also a very conflicted issue because of the water wars that happened a few years earlier. 2007, the concession, negotiated settlement and the contract takes place. EPSIS arises as taking over the operations of the utility. 2009, 3 years later, the new constitution is adopted with the human right to water provision. So that's just a very quick overview. He wanted to just have you have a sense of the tremendous change happening in the country. So going back in detail a little bit, he wants to make the point here about Bolivia, a country in debt, dramatically increasing, escalating interest as a solution to the debt crisis. With the IMF and World Bank policies, the country implements a series of structural adjustments, liberalization of capital markets, unilateral opening to foreign trade, extensive privatization of state enterprises. So structural adjustment, conditions imposed by the structural adjustment process has two rationales. You will all be very familiar with this. Bolivia should be developed from private investment. This could bring in capital, new technology, could be a source of employment, development, and modernization for the country, and because it's a response to the collapse of the state that led to the bankruptcy. The three mechanisms for privatization that Bolivia considers are direct sales of assets, capitalization, and concessions, which was applied to the water sector. So the concessions in the water and sanitation sector, there were two. Suez got the concession in El Alto and La Paz, Aguas de Yimani. In 1997, discontinued 10 years later. Bechtel won the concession contract in Cochabamba. Aguas de Tunari, 6 months later, negotiated an exit of Bechtel. So the purpose of the concessions, the rationale, expanding service to the poor.
Patricia, would it be better if we have questions to intersperse them or to wait till you finish?
I think, what would you prefer to do? We can, ¿se oye bien? Julián, ¿está siguiendo las transparencias y la conversación todavía? ¿Hasta ahora?
Sí.
Okay. Would you like to do?
Sure. I mean, I think it might, because my question is just very sort of specific to this, which is these were two cities, and I know at one point there was a third city, Santa Cruz, that was considered, but then because of the urban cooperatives, it wasn't. And I was just wondering if you could just speak a little bit about that.
Julián, tiene Sharmela una pregunta. Quisiera que durante la presentación, que si es posible que recibas preguntas y contesta preguntas, ¿está bien?
No hay ningún problema, Patricia, adelante.
Ok, está Sharmela preguntando si es... I wonder if we should... Do you guys want to see his face?
Yeah.
While we do this? Está preguntando Sharmila que según su entendimiento hubo una propuesta de privatizar la empresa en Santa Cruz, pero por el hecho de que hubo la cooperación en Santa Cruz, público, social, que no quisieron privatizar la empresa y si tenga alguna reflexión sobre el tópico.
La propuesta del Fondo Monetario y del Banco Mundial era de que en las 3 ciudades más grandes de Bolivia se vaya a la privatización.
Okay, so in 3, the proposal from the World Bank was that the 3 largest cities in Bolivia, the privatization take place.
Se procedió en La Paz, El Alto, en Cochabamba, pero Santa Cruz no, porque allá en Santa Cruz es un modelo diferente que está manejado, si tú quieres, por un grupo de personas que hace muchos años están en la empresa, es decir, por una parte es un modelo cooperativo.
So the privatizations did take place in El Alto and La Paz, but in Santa Cruz there was a different structure. It has the character of a cooperative.
Y por otra parte, este modelo cooperativo se ha convertido en una especie de que responde, si tú quieres, a los grupos de poder de Santa Cruz. Por lo tanto, hubo una oposición más que de la población de Santa Cruz, de estos grupos de poder que manejan la empresa en Santa Cruz.
And just to be clear, the cooperative actually responds to different power groups in Santa Cruz, so it doesn't have the character of a cooperative that you might first imagine, but it is a function of these power interests in Santa Cruz.
Y como en Santa Cruz, este grupo tenía y aún mantiene ese poder sobre la empresa, entonces el gobierno boliviano prefiere no meterse a privatizar en Santa Cruz, pero sí en las otras 2 ciudades.
So because of the political power of this group in Santa Cruz, the Bolivian government chose to not undertake privatization, but did privatize in the other 2 cities.
Just before I came here, I looked at the Atlas of Water. I don't know if you've seen that. I looked up Bolivia, and I don't remember the term they used, but I think they described Bolivia as having, in terms of water supply, moderate sufficiency. And they gave it, like the United States and Canada had, around the other extreme, they're very, very plentiful in most of the United States. But is that the backdrop? In other words, we're talking about problems with delivery, but isn't it in the backdrop of having fairly sufficient supply?
Moderate sufficiency or fairly?
I think they said moderately sufficient. Is that the term?
Entonces, uno de las personas en la sala está pidiendo algún contenido sobre los recursos hidráulicos. Es decir, según su información, Bolivia en un informe está presentado como si tiene más o menos suficiente recursos hidráulicos. Pero ¿eso es la verdad? ¿O cuál papel esa juega en el contexto de lo que estamos hablando?
Bueno, efectivamente Bolivia tiene gran disponibilidad de recursos hídricos. El problema está que están mal distribuidos, es decir, que están muy fuera del alcance de las ciudades donde se requiere el agua, ¿no?
So, one of the things to understand, yes, the hydrological resources in Bolivia are extensive. The problem is they're not located where they're needed.
En el caso de Cochabamba y en el caso de Santa Cruz son los casos más complicados, porque en Cochabamba se tiene que traer el recurso agua desde muy lejos, muchos kilómetros de la ciudad de Cochabamba, lo cual encarece muchísimo más el costo final el usuario, ¿no?
So, for example, in the situation in Cochabamba, the resources are actually located at great distance from the city. They have to be brought to the city, which increases the cost to the consumer.
En Santa Cruz sucede algo similar, simplemente que la diferencia es de que se extrae el agua de pozos profundos. Y como en Santa Cruz cada vez es una ciudad muy contaminada por falta de alcantarillado sanitario o saneamiento, entonces cada vez tienen que profundizar más para extraer el agua. Están entre 200 a 300 metros ya de donde se saque el agua, ¿no?
The Santa Cruz situation is a bit different. They use very deep wells as getting access to the water resources. Santa Cruz, the groundwater there, unfortunately, is very contaminated because of the lack of sanitation and other reasons. So they're having to continually deepen the wells in order to get access to resources there.
En este momento en Cochabamba tenemos un conflicto producto de que se está trayendo agua de otro municipio, de otra ciudad a Cochabamba. Por lo tanto, los de ese municipio han reclamado, ya no quieren dar agua a la ciudad de Cochabamba. Entonces el conflicto está en eso, ¿no? La disponibilidad de agua en Bolivia es el problema, ¿no?
So in Cochabamba, for example, we have a situation arising where the demand in Cochabamba is increasing. They are actually bringing the water resources from the region of another city. That city has increasing needs, so there's a conflict being created between the two cities and access to resources. So that's one of the situations that they're dealing with. So just to go back to this, two concessions. Response to the social movements. First water war in Cochabamba. There is a coalition, Coordinadora for Water and Life. Several Fejuve in Cochabamba, political parties, grassroots organizations, civil society rose up against the privatization, the concession there. In El Alto, the gas war calls for through the high process of structural adjustment, the oil sector and gas sector were nationalized, increase in prices, lack of access. El Alto rose up. The response left many dead and several wounded. Second water war rather in El Alto in 2004. So civil society, why was the concession failing for them? The original goals of the concession, in the case of El Alto and La Paz, rather than Suez buying into the utility, they offered, as a part of the contract terms, to increase and extend service to 71,000 water connections in the city of El Alto in 5 years. So the contract was awarded on this basis in 1997. Fejuve, throughout the 5 years of the concession, was concerned with the failure to meet those connection targets. Only 44,000 were connected. Citizens actually were required to pay close to 8,000 connections, 21,000 sewer connections. So Suez complied with 62% of their contract obligations. There was a term in the contract which would automatically rescind the contract if they fell less than 25% of the terms, so clearly that was the case. They failed to meet other concession targets. They did not meet their estimated investment levels, which is $70 million. There were several instances where they breached existing environmental law in Bolivia. There was an audit part of the way through into the concession, which highlighted some difficult problems with the concession, so the confidence with the concession on the part of the community fell. There was a default in connections. Poor families or families in El Alto had paid, you have to pay up front in order to get a connection. The utility had a period of time, I don't know what it was, we can ask, 6 months, a year, that the utility would have to actually make the connection after the household had paid. There were defaults of significant delays in time. And there was also a concern about payments to Suez of $20 million over the contract maximum, which had capped Suez earnings at 13%. So what the community felt was a flight of capital out of the country and out of the utility. So there's a negotiated settlement to dissolve the contract in this process. he jumped right into this without saying who Julién was. Julién was a technical advisor for FEJUVE. When the water ministry was established, he was a staff person for the water ministry. He was the primary staff person, staffing the minister throughout the transition to cancel this contract and set up the new utility from the ministry. At a point in the negotiations, he decided to resign his commission because of disagreement with the government position and return to FEJUVE. So he has both civil society, government, and civil society, again, experience. He's an architect by training, is a PhD candidate in a university in England, Newcastle, and has a master's in sustainable development from the University of Mayor de San Simón in Bolivia. So he's a primary staff person. He's an insider in this process. This is the information that he shares with us. ISA, the utility, the concessionaire, Aguas de Limanis Sudamérica, proposes that EPSAS pay to Suez ISA. The terms varied throughout the negotiations, 50 to 120 million to terminate the contract, upfront payment. EPSAS contracts, the Bolivian government contracts with an auditing firm to actually look into what investment Suez actually performed. We'll talk about that report in just a moment because it was of high concern for civil society. At that point, EPSAS Suez backs down off of these very high payments and asks for 22 million. The negotiations continue. The final agreement, the Bolivian government agrees to pay, agrees that EPSAS will assume the debt that ISA contracted and pay Suez 5.5 million to leave.
And Patricia, was that agreement, was that privately negotiated or was that negotiated in some forum? Meaning it wasn't like an arbitration, this was a private negotiation between...
Oh no, direct. The government itself, we can ask. Charmela está pidiendo sobre la negociación de cancelar el contrato. ¿Eso fue en un tribunal o fue privado directamente de los contrapartes?
En ambas partes. Si bien la negociación fue entre el Suez y el gobierno boliviano, de manera directa, pero algunos socios de Suez, los socios argentinos y los socios franceses iniciaron un juicio al gobierno boliviano en el CIADI, que es la instancia donde se lleva a cabo estos juicios, que es del Banco Mundial también.
Both actually. There were direct negotiations between Suez and the Bolivian government, but the other members of the partnership that was Aguas de Limanis, which were the another French group of investors and the Argentinian investors actually took parts of this to the World Bank dispute resolution exit process. So a little bit about the audit report. This was quite an interesting point that Julién wanted to make. It's PricewaterhouseCoopers was the firm that Suez actually works with around the world in its utilities. Pricewaterhouse had provided technical services to both sides, the Bolivian government and to the utility. At a point in the negotiations, it became clear there was a great disagreement about what actually was the level of investment by Suez. The Bolivian government contracted a regional Latin American firm who actually did an audit, and this was some of the findings that led to the final settlement. 65 million in assets at the beginning of the concession, depreciation, so forth, 47 million. There was $22 million of investments that Suez or Aguas de Limanis claimed that were not able to be verified or substantiated by the auditing firm. So the firm was able to only substantiate $19 million roughly of investment by the partnership. And then it took a little bit closer look at what these investments were. Some details in purchase of land and so forth, ended up with being able to verify $22 million of investments by the utility, by the private concessionaire, but then took a look at what were the outstanding payments that the concessionaire owed to the Bolivian government, and actually, at the end of the report, determined that the utility, ISA, owed the Bolivian government $6 million. So that report was key to have the negotiations drop that final payment to $5.5 million. So the transition from Suez to EPSAS. Suez ceases to operate in 2007. EPSAS, which is the Empresa Pública y Social de Agua y Saneamiento, the public utility for water and sanitation, assumes operation, proposes and begins to operate using the commercial business model for the utility, even though it's under the public sector. It continues to use the commercial business model that ISA had been using with Suez the last 5 years. FEJUVE proposes, the civil society proposes a different model, what they call public and social character. Throughout both the public and the private, the concessionaire period, there were serious problems on the part, at least in the view of the community, with corruption, with lack of transparency, lack of accountability, millions and millions of dollars at play being lost or not being able to be accounted for. So they wanted something that was more democratic, more participatory, and so that the public themselves had more of a direct oversight and could look into some of these questions. They wanted in particular that more democratic participatory character to be of a binding character. The FEJUVE proposal is not accepted by EPSAS or the municipality, La Paz. So what are the options for EPSAS in that period? They could have chosen to reinvest the earnings that are generated by the utility in the order of $5 to $6 million in order to extend services to El Alto. La Paz has pretty much full coverage. This is not the case in El Alto. They could implement the constitutional human right to water in 2009. They could continue what they call a social tariff. It's a special rate that Julién hopes you ask about, so we can go more in depth later. But what are some of the barriers for the utility, for the public utility? They have to repay the Bolivian government the $5.5 million that they paid Suez to leave. So the utility had to assume that debt. They had to repay the loans to foreign international financial institutions, the BID, the Inter-American Development Bank, the IMF, and another regional development bank of about $24 million. The utility chose to continue operating on a commercial basis. It has an outdated fee structure, and one of the things that the utility had asked of PricewaterhouseCoopers as the concession was winding down was to design a new tariff structure, but it has not been implemented. The management of the utility, FEJUVE felt, had been politicized, so it was responding to the political changes as in political parties, elections, those kinds of things, and that had created a problem. There's a looming requirement for foreign assistance. This maybe gets to the question about access to water resources. It's estimated anywhere from $44 million to $220 million to actually extend, get access to bring basic water into the area. There's a high demand for extended service in El Alto, 220,000 people without service, high growth of population at somewhere in the near, in El Alto alone, of 5 to 6% per year. EPSAS began to consider removing what they called the solidarity program in tariffs. So these were some of the barriers that the utility had to deal with. So the government, the Bolivian government, makes a proposal called Water for All to the municipality of El Alto. mention that Julián points out that La Paz has nearly full coverage for services, so the investment is actually needed in El Alto, estimated at $200 billion. Without the earnings of the water bills, the revenue from La Paz, there's no possibility for El Alto to do financing. There aren't current government resources for investment. Currently, El Alto has only about 15% of total EPSA staff, so there'd have to be a big build out in terms of actual staff and technical expertise in the municipality. The government proposal required a significant restructuring and the creation of actually 3 entities, a bulk water supplier, and then the 2 utilities, La Paz and El Alto. On the question of civil society's demand for social control and oversight, the government proposal is basically no. Participation, community, the government agreed to consult the community, but would hold primary decision-making powers, so no binding character of public participation. No cross-subsidy, no progressive rate structure that reflects the social solidarity tariff, and actually the legal frameworks excluded in the government proposal excluded the constitutional human right to water provision. So it was quite surprising. So FEJUVE's response in El Alto, in the beginning, as Julián pointed out, there was, because of the politicization of the process, their elections, second term for Morales fell in here. The former leadership agreed to separate the utility. That agreement was scrapped. Currently, FEJUVE El Alto wants full coverage of service in El Alto, and then we'll decide to separate the utility or not. The FEJUVE expressed strong opposition to the government model. Earlier in the year, the government scraps the model that they proposed. FEJUVE, but doesn't move to create a new model. FEJUVE just called for a work stoppages in July. The EPSIS manager and board offered to resign in August. The board does resign. Currently, the EPSIS manager is still in place. So there's a new board for EPSIS itself. So today, where are we at? The government has retired its proposal under opposition of communities and civil society. A new model will be brought forward in consultation with the social movements the government has committed. The government has accepted to implement the human right to water in the new model. That was a strong sticking point. They, for 18 months, refused to move on that point. They have moved and conceded. Social movements, FEJUVE, are seeking funding for a new tariff study that will actually implement the human right to water. The key problems with how to implement the human right to water in these water and sanitation utilities, whether they're public or private, is how to finance. So before we go to questions and answers, Julián, agregué algunas transparencias que tienen una traducción de los artículos de la Constitución aquí. Entonces, en inglés, para que no sé si las personas están conscientes. So we did a very rough translation of the Bolivian constitutional human right to water. Just take a minute to look at that. I don't know how many of you have actually read these. Están leyéndolo.
Is the government policy to allow for privatization of supplying services, but the ownership of the resource would never be privatized.
You see the third point here? And then I'll ask Julián. Una pregunta de uno de los participantes es la política del gobierno de no privatizar los bienes de una empresa, es decir, no dejar privatizar como dueño la empresa, pero que se puede las operaciones o de brindar los servicios sea privatizado. Y apunté el parte de artículo 20 en la Constitución que prohibida esto, pero no sé si quieres agregar algún comentario.
Bueno, paradójicamente, a partir de las dos guerras del agua que hemos tenido, y la guerra del gas también, que fue realmente muy complicado para los alteños, lo que esperábamos nosotros era de que ya no se permita la presencia del sector privado en el sector de agua.
So it became a very complicated issue, but what the Constitution sets out is that the private sector is not allowed in the water sector. ¿Se puede agregar algo más?
Sí. Lastimosamente, pero en la Constitución, en esta nueva Constitución, tenemos el artículo 20, inciso 2, que indica que es posible participar el sector privado a través de las empresas de economía mixta, es decir, lo público y privado. Ahí va la pregunta, ¿no? De que en este momento en la Constitución dice que es permitido que venga el sector privado a administrar de manera conjunta con el Estado.
The new Constitution, as you saw by Article 20, allows private sector participation in operations and administration rather, but only in combination, so public-private partnership.
Entonces, fue una sorpresa para nosotros que estuvimos dentro de estas guerras del agua, de que el Estado boliviano actual, el gobierno de Evo Morales, permita que todavía se pueda tener la presencia del sector privado en el sector del agua. Fue una sorpresa y una decepción por parte de muchos nosotros.
So it was a great surprise, actually, that proposal was brought forward by the Bolivian government, in particular after the two water wars, and on the part of civil society and people engaged in the water and sanitation sector, they felt deceived. But it is there in the Constitution.